to the Mechanical Engineering webinar, Building Better Post-Pandemic Supply Chains. This is the third of our series of 6 conversations about rebooting after the pandemic. I'm Alan Brown, Senior Editor of ASME's Mechanical Engineering magazine, and today's moderator. The webinar is sponsored by Eccentric Mold and Engineering, a specialist in quick turnaround machine, molded, and 3D printed parts. Today, we will be asking 3 leaders about supply chain risk management and how to achieve it. Before I introduce them, though, let's spend a moment on supply chains and resilience. Supply chains, the flow of materials and components that keep factories and warehouses humming, are the lifeblood of business. And, as we learned in this pandemic and in previous earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, and hurricanes, they can easily break. Resilient supply chains will never protect you or anyone else 100% against an unanticipated disaster, like a pandemic that closes down the globe. When it strikes, you and everyone else will take a hit. But resilient supply chains will enable businesses to bounce back faster, even while the crisis is evolving. This is because they give you early warning signs of problems, they provide transparency to quickly locate vulnerabilities, and they have the agility to respond to those potential weaknesses before your competitors, whether that involves finding a new vendor, rerouting its transportation, or re-engineering a product to make it work with the capabilities you have available. Our 3 speakers today are experts in creating this kind of supply chain. So let me introduce them. Greg Turman is Global Vice President of Materials, Logistics, and Freight Management at AGCO Corp., a $9 billion manufacturer of agricultural equipment with nearly 80 facilities worldwide. Greg led the digital transformation of AGCO's supply chain, which has won several prestigious awards for innovation and effectiveness. Bindia Vakil is CEO and founder of rethink, which supplies cloud-based supply chain visibility and analytics solutions that help companies quantify risk. Bindia is also a founder of the Global Supply Chain Resiliency Council, a nonprofit dedicated to advancing supply chain risk management. Our third guest is Shekhar Visvanathan, Vice President of Global Procurement for Mercury Marine, a leader in marine propulsion and outboard motors with facilities in the United States, Japan, and China. He led Mercury's creation of a digital supply chain that systematically reduces risk by applying data analytics and lean principles to sourcing strategies. So, before we talk about how to build a resilient supply chain, let's look at what a resilient supply chain can do. We'll start at the beginning. When did you first start monitoring coronavirus in Wuhan, and what were some of your first responses? Shekhar, would you like to go first?
Sure. For us, the Wuhan situation was evolving right about the Chinese New Year. We have a facility in China. That's where we started seeing the impact first being felt because we had to shut the facility down. Our supply chains, our suppliers, partners in the region were all under lockdown. That was our first introduction to it. And as time progressed, parts of the country started coming back up, and we could bring our operations domestically back up and running. So that's our first introduction to how this pandemic would evolve. If you turn back time, that was a microcosm of what we all saw.
Yeah, Greg, was that the same experience for you?
Very similar, Alan. For us, it started in, let's call it the mid-January time period as we were getting ready to shut down our facilities for the Chinese New Year and Spring Festival. We have a very structured set of processes and ways of working as we prepare for that to ensure that all supply is green, meaning exited China before the New Year activity started, and being prepared for the ramp up, which typically, you got 2 days or 2 weeks of shutdown, then 2 weeks of ramp up as the people are coming back in facilities. Let's call it on or about the 17th of January, we were talking in our weekly sessions about the growing Wuhan virus that we've been hearing about since really early December within China. At that point in time in late January, some of our team members started to understand a bit from the China government what was going to happen, the duration, and possibly what some of the restart activities and requirements would look like. And at that point in time, we went into action.
So what kind of action?
So, of course. So at that point in time, the first thing that we try to understand is where are we currently at today, right, in terms of supply versus our demands. Because we were getting ready for the Chinese New Year shutdown, we pretty much knew. So the question then became, okay, what will the priorities be when the China, call it country industrial, ramps back up? So it's very easy to come up with what that is. Then we basically started to go into how and what other solutions do we have? So alternate sources of supply, what if scenarios, different transportation, et cetera. And then the magic question says, where is possible next set of risks going to come? And I think maybe we'll get into that in the next question.
Okay. Bindia, how about you? Your software is supposed to be able to look at these things, right?
Yeah, so I was actually going to say that I just want to put a little bit of context on before I talk about how ResLink found out about this and started doing helping customers. What we do is we use AI and machine learning, natural language processing to basically scan for disruptions that are reported in news media, social media, etc., across over 100 languages. And we're picking up these disruptions, almost 45 different types of ways in which supply chain could be disrupted, including supplier lawsuits and, in the life science pharma industry, FDA regulations like recalls or Form 483s that get issued, and human health type of things like a pandemic or epidemic. So we, because we're monitoring social media and we don't have feet on the ground in China, unlike Greg, as you described, you have feet on the ground in region. So we're monitoring social media. We picked up the news around December 28th using our social media feeds when the news was first reported to the hospitals in China to notify the local government about any of these new cases. So we started internally monitoring. We alerted our customers on January 4th. And so what ResLink does in addition to the monitoring is we actually do mapping. So we are mapping the supply chain multiple tiers deep, identifying who are the suppliers that the customer uses, where their sites are, who are the second and third tier suppliers that they use, and where their sites are located. So when an event like this happens, when we alert our customers, we actually drew the region around Wuhan, and our customers immediately extracted exactly which sites are located in Wuhan. What alternate sites does the supplier in the mapping process identify as being available for the customer to move to? And then which parts specifically came from the sites that were in Wuhan? So what some of our customers reported to us after the January 4th alert that went out was that they immediately not only used the Wuhan area, but they drew a large circle around the entire Wuhan into the Hubei province and basically extracted all the parts, all the alternate sites and everything, and really started to prepare for having conversations with the suppliers. And obviously, Chinese New Year, as Greg correctly mentioned, was coming up. So in the context of Chinese New Year, but also in preparation, in case this became a worst case scenario, they were developing a playbook, for if this were to become a worst case scenario, how would they respond? How would they activate an alternate site, et cetera?
I've got to ask you, did anybody think it would get as bad as it did?
Not until, if you're asking me, I'll say not until January 22nd, when the lockdown of Wuhan came into effect. Then it was immediately apparent that this was very bad indeed.
Greg, Shekhar, you were both shaking your heads.
Yeah, I'd let Greg speak first and then I can add on.
It was about the same time, at or about the 17th of January for us, is when things got very exciting. So, yeah.
I mean, from our perspective, we thought the human-to-human transmission piece was probably not as pronounced. So it was an episode of, will it be like SARS? Will it be a regional thing that gets contained, or the swine flu that happened a few years ago? That's what was playing in our initial thinking. But as the lockdown happened, as it got extended, and then, there's something serious happening on the ground there.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please continue.
I was going to say, so as it spread worldwide, having the visibility early, did that help you?
It did. It helped us in our process of how we are going to triage, monitor, manage. Basically, thinking about it from what next to do. So there was a playbook ready to go. We knew exactly what we did in country, in region. So as it traverses the globe, comes to Europe, comes to the U.S., in Mexico, we could get a jump start and react to the situation quick and fast.
So give me one example from that playbook of something you were able to do that kept you going, where without that kind of visibility, you wouldn't have been able to.
One of the things that we were actively doing when it started hitting initially in Europe, as the case counts started spiking, we were expedient in moving, pulling all inventory from the region back to our operations. We're predominantly manufacturing here in the U.S. So we actively took that proactive step to beef up our ability to keep us sustain our operations domestically.
Okay, Greg, how about you?
So very, very similar to what Bindia had shared, with our risk management, call it package, we monitor all the social activity, et cetera. So in late January, we reached out to them and said, how do we put some level of filter related to COVID? We started that dialogue. They at the time didn't have anything immediately available. So what we did was took that package, and then we're able to, through our own means, figure out the number of cases that were reported per postal code. So very similar to what Bindia had mentioned, they were able, with surgical accuracy, able to see where those challenges were. We utilized that initially in Japan and in Korea. And based on the success, we were able to pull a number of days out before the government restrictions went in that took away your ability to take decisions. We then mapped that in Europe, and were able to successfully pull product that had 10 working days in Italy, and then subsequently in Switzerland, Spain, and Sweden very, very efficiently. From there, we then continued to utilize the methodology in South America and North America. And with just surgical accuracy, we were able to determine which suppliers with which product lines would be impacted. And subsequently, we started to pull ahead. And as a result, we were able to buy time that then enabled those alternate playbooks to be executed. And so when you talk about playbooks, when is the best time to have one prepared? Before you need it. So when you come down to how are you able to do X, Y, and Z, if you press the button and say, person A goes after X, person B goes after Y, and person C goes after Z, things are moving. And when you're in a situation like all of us were in, time is the most valuable resource that you have. Decision-making is one of the fastest and most important actions that you can take. And if you sit back and are trying to come up with perfection of everything being perfect in terms of data, you probably would still be asking the questions, what do I need to do next as all of my factories and customers are in trouble?
I'm Bindi, before I get to you, I want to follow up with you, Greg, and then I'm going to shift the question slightly, which is, one of the things I read that really, really surprised me was that you started stockpiling personal protective equipment early. Mm-hmm. And then you were offering it to vendors, but only if they would work on your products first. Mm-hmm. Where did that come from? I mean, is that something that you were able to do because you were way ahead of this? I mean, where did that come from?
We believe so, Alan. Absolutely, Alan. We believe so. And that started on that January 17th phone call that I got from my partner in crime, Jason Chow, in China. And he said, this is what we understand will be the protocols for restarting your factories after the lockdown is done. And we did a quick assessment with our suppliers on where they stood. We said, well, we probably are going to have a challenge. So within hours of that, call it call for help, our regions in North America, South America, and Europe started pulling in PPE, primarily masks and gloves and some capes. And with that, by let's call it late January, we had inventory positioned in near Chicago and just north of Paris that we were then able to distribute in small quantities into various parts of China to get our suppliers and our sites up and running again. And, you know, it wasn't like a really hard sell. Mr. Supplier, we have PPE. All we ask is you make our stuff first. We had no pushback, none whatsoever, right? And the intention was not to strong arm anybody, but rather help. Safety first.
It's a cool story. Are there other things that visibility lets, I'll talk to Shekhar and Bindia now. Are there other things that having visibility let you or your customers do?
Yeah, visibility is the ultimate king here. So when we think about this crisis, it's primarily a people crisis followed by a supply chain crisis. Having visibility on the front end, on the inbound side from suppliers, sub-tiers like Bindia was saying and Greg's alluding to, that tremendously helps in ensuring that the supply continuity, building a product, and then understanding on the customer side, having visibility into what they're building, what they're going to need, definitely helps both ends of the spectrum. For us, similar to what Greg's describing, the biggest thing is about the partnerships come in to keep focus here with the suppliers. We had a little bit of a different take than you did, Greg. We didn't have to go give them PPE. They had enough access to it once the factories came back up. On the flip side, they came to offer us help for our US operations. We have some PPE that we can ship to you. Don't even bother to ask what to pay. I'm just going to do it because I care for you, dear customer. So that's what got built up through this. Pretty cool.
That's cool. Bindia?
Yeah, so I think the key thing here is time, right? And so this is really information arbitrage. Visibility allows you to play information arbitrage. If you think about Wall Street, companies pay tens of millions of dollars to be the first to know about something so that they can be the first to take advantage and sell or buy. It's basically the same thing. Eventually, all procurement organizations find out who's impacted, which parts, what product. It can take you 6 weeks to know, or it can take you 6 minutes to know. Visibility is how you get to the 6 minutes, right? Having the supply chain mapped ahead of time, knowing who the suppliers are, where their sites are located, and which parts are made, stored, or distributed in different parts of the world is information that is gold in a crisis. Because that information allows you to act, and Greg, you said it very well, it's a very precise, very surgical way to act because I've been in procurement for many, many years. I worked in procurement at Cisco and Flextronics in the high-tech industry. And I know the value. If someone tells me this supplier is risky or that site is risky, it's not as valuable as knowing, hey, there was a factory fire at this site in China that builds these 3 parts for you. And so now I'm not trying to do a risk buy on the 70 parts that I buy from that supplier a year, but the 3 parts that are actually made at that factory. So getting there within minutes is gold. It is dollars and cents. And it is tremendously valuable because you just sail past that event, that could be hugely disruptive. And without the visibility, and by visibility, I not only mean mapping, but the continuous monitoring, the ability to sense that the factory fire happened in the first place, right? Both those things together, knowing something has happened, the detection, finishing the analysis quickly using the existing mapping, and then having a playbook to act on the information and having the corporate buy-in to make budget available, resources available to execute. That is an end-to-end best-in-class program.
Or to translate it into something we're all familiar with, it's finding out your plane's been canceled 5 minutes before everyone else.
Or using a Waze type app, on your daily commute to guarantee you get to work in 20 minutes instead of getting stuck on an accident-related backup.
Okay, good. So let me ask the next question then. How are you planning for the post-pandemic recovery? Clearly, you're all playing different roles. So let me start with you, Greg, because AGCO, farming is an essential business, and it's running strong. So how do you ensure you're meeting? You have the lucky problem of having to meet demand. How are you going to do it?
So we just continue doing what we're doing, and within that, at this point in time, all of our sites are assessing what level of risk would they believe would be tolerable in the late quarter 3, early quarter 4. And with that, we will and already are in the process of supplementing our component inventory levels, reallocating supply, call it splits, or instead of buying 80% in Italy, maybe I buy 40% in Italy and 60% in the US, where we can take decisions based on factual data that we know. What data we know? Which countries had problems before? Which governments were maybe a bit more aggressive than others? We know the state of health systems. So there's a lot of things that we know to enable us to take better decisions as we go into this, some of which will be actions we've taken now already in the past weeks, some of which will be decisions that we'll be taking as we get closer to the autumn time period in the Northern Hemisphere when the risk is out there.
And you allocate, do you do things like allocate what you get to the product lines with the most profitability, for example?
If we have a challenge, yes, all of our decisions are based on customer orientation, margin, et cetera. So there are certain products that would have a internal hierarchy that's higher than maybe other products. That's fully aligned as how we operate on an annual basis. That enables fast decision making, which saves time. So we are, what we believe, well prepared based on what we know and what we don't know to move into the next phase of the unknown in the latter part of the year. Will we be right? Not 100%. Will we be partially right? Most likely. Will our network and our team and our culture enable us to get through it? We strongly believe so.
Okay, now Shekhar, you have a totally different type of problem. I imagine demand for pleasure boats during the pandemic probably did not do great. So you're facing, you don't know what demand's going to be like when things start to get better, do you? I mean, how do you deal with the uncertainty?
That's a great question. So we start by thinking demand, if only we knew, the only thing right about demand is what we know is it's going to be wrong. What it's going to be.
Yeah.
As supply chain professionals, you're dealing with variability. One of the key things that we thought going into this would be how would customers react? Frankly, social distancing is actually helping us in terms of what we think demand's going to be. You see articles in the press about RV sales, boat sales all going up. So which is definitely a positive leading indicator. So we have to start thinking about what does demand profile look like. You go into scenario planning, entering into this, you say you're down X, down Y, and then you start planning to it. Now you have to think about it. Maybe it's not going to be as bad as we thought it is. Much like Greg, you start deploying your resources, turning everybody into not into a conservation mode, but into an expansionist, get more product in so we can keep pace with demand. That is primarily our singular focus right now, turning and pivoting away from a shutdown mode to a restart and accelerate mode.
So you're hoping everybody's used this forced stay at home, at least those who have jobs, to save up their money so they can buy the boat of their dreams.
Absolutely.
We've seen a very similar aspect when what we call our compact and sport utility vehicle. And typically that is what we call hobby farmers. And very similar to what Sakar had shared is was a positive surprise that as a result of people staying home, they're saving a little bit more money. They're not going on spring break. They've got money to buy something else and they're ready to spend it.
Yeah, it could take off like a rocket. It's a surprise. So Vindhya, your phone has probably been ringing off the hook because
Yes.
everybody wants all that insight into the supply chain and they want it yesterday.
Yes,
So
I mean this.
let me just finish. What do they tell?
Yeah.
What are they telling you
Yeah.
in terms of what they want, and what are you telling them in terms
Yeah,
of what
so
they can get?
What happens typically is that, we've had a couple of years of relative calm on the supply chain side. We've had some major incidents like Hurricane Maria and all of that. But I think a lot of us forgot that we really lack that second and third tier visibility and how critical it is. And so I think this crisis, I mean, you see news upon news of what companies experienced, and really what we saw post this, last couple of months, everyone we're talking to right now is really talking about, hey, we need mapping. We need to understand that second and third tier, have that visibility. But also, how do we use that information, So we're helping our customers not only collect the data, but how can you not identify what your second and third tier failure points are? For example, what we call the diamond-shaped supply chain, where your supply chain sort of fans out in the beginning, but then in the second tier, you see a lot of your direct suppliers are all buying from the same second tier source, right? So we're helping to bring out those failure points and then helping them create a process whereby they can connect to those second or third tier suppliers, manage them directly, and have an ongoing partnership with someone you don't do any direct business with. So those are kind of some of the key things that have come out as learnings where our customers and new prospects are also going in the near future.
And how long does it take to set something like that up?
It's two things, right? And I've done this in-house. When I was at Cisco, we built our own in-house system to map the supply chain, and it took us 3.5 years and quite a lot of resources. So when I started Resolink, what I did was I recognized that if every company tried to map on their own, it would be a tremendous amount of work for suppliers. What we really needed was a way like what we call the LinkedIn for supply chain, so that a supplier can come on the Resolink platform, map their supply chain out, and approve many customers' access to the pre-mapped data. So as new companies join the platform, they don't have to start from scratch. It doesn't take 3.5 years. It doesn't take an army. In fact, it doesn't even take $1 million. So it's very easy to get started. You're working with a pre-existing subset of your suppliers who are already working on the Resolink platform. And we have collected mapping data for over 100,000 companies across high-tech, auto, semiconductor, industrial, like aerospace, defense, life science, pharma, etc.
I keep forgetting that you've been around for 10 years as a company.
I have, yes, been doing this for 10 years. Long time.
Now, great. So before I get to how we build a supply chain, a more resilient supply chain, I have a polling question from our sponsor, Eccentric. And the question is, to what extent do you rely on your manufacturing partners, such as mold makers and rapid prototypers, to provide guidance with product re-engineering? Rarely or never, A. B. Occasionally, C. Half the time, D. Quite often, or E. Our manufacturing partners are an essential part of the process. Normally this would pause for about 30 seconds, but I think we'll move along. So, back to our discussion. I'm curious about how a resilient supply chain differs from a conventional supply chain. For example, many years ago, particularly back in the early 2000s, late 90s, supply chains were all about cost. Is that still the case? Who'd like to start?
I can jump in. Cost is ultimately going to matter. It's nothing's ever free and nothing's too cheap or nothing's too expensive. I think what you're trying to get to is best cost, not lowest cost. Mm-hmm. And then you get into this concept of what is total landed cost, what is cost of the product and maintaining the product in the field and so on and so forth. It's an evolution from I want the lowest piece price to a holistic view of how you're managing costs for your customer, either internal or ultimately the consumer who's going to pay for the product.
And how does risk play into that? I mean, do you think of risk as part of cost also?
Risk is definitely an element that, so there is no single dimensional numerical value that you can assign risk to cost. However, it becomes a qualitative discussion at that point as to how you structure your supply chains, or where do you source from, what do you source, and how do you, it's a complex web that we weave, and you have to solve it every single day.
You know, it's interesting because Bindi, on your website, you say you quantify risk. Mm-hmm. So what are you doing that Shakar is not?
So what we look at is we look at this notion of total cost of ownership, right? So in order to do a offshore so set up an offshore supply chain in pursuit of low cost, what we end up doing is we increase the risk of the supply chain. And also, not only have we stretched the supply chain across oceans, we've gone lean over the last 10 years. So these two combined have created a supply chain where you have added additional costs, such as things like you need more staff to manage this supply chain, which is cost of risk. Then you have ongoing frequent instances of purchase price variances, what we call PPE, where you end up having to pay $20 for the $2 part, right? Because there was a disruption, you were buying it, you were on allocation. So there's a cost of that. So on an annual basis, if you aggregate your total PPV, that's your cost of risk. The third is the cost of freight expedites, right? So what we look at is on an annualized basis, what is the cost of unplanned freight as an aggregate, where you had to airship something instead of ocean. So anything that is unplanned is, again, because you had to expedite in a bind, and that's cost of risk. The third is the cost of going lines down, right? So the moment you have a factory that doesn't have enough raw material, and let's say it's a 40,000, like we used to build large scale routers at Cisco, and a $10 part could basically cause us to have all that raw material in WIP that can't be shipped because we're waiting for that $10 part. So this is how much inventory in WIP that can't be productive, the cost of the line being down, you're still paying utilities, wages, all of that. So there's a cash burn element to it. Some large automotive companies have actually quantified the cost of being lines down. And one of them said that it can be as high as $1 million a minute, just in the WIP that is sitting there, the factory, the rental, the lease, whatever the, cash tied up. And then lastly, the revenue impact. So in the case of, I hate to bring up toilet paper on this call, but you have huge demand for toilet paper. The shelf is empty. The retailer has lost revenue. You have lost revenue. There is a cost to losing revenue, right? So there's demand, but if you can't meet that demand, that's lost business. There's a cost there.
Okay, Craig, care to add anything?
Agree with what both previous presenters shared. It's really, what does the cost of failure do to your business? That could be monetarily, that also could be customer perception, which is very difficult to put a value on. Yeah. On our side, this is something that over time we've got better at. And we have automated processes today that are updated on a quarterly basis at the commodity level between a pair, a shipping origin, that would be a supplier postal code, that commodity level, and what the destination may be. The destination could be different based on the product line, the margins that we make, where that product line is in the eyes of our overall strategy, and subsequently our buyers, when they receive a response online on our quote platform, they press a magic button, or it can automatically be calculated that says the total landing cost and risk factor is XYZ ABC 1, 2, 3. And then within that, if they have any questions, then they can ask that to the appropriate people who going to reach into it. But, is it 100% perfect? No. Is it directionally accurate? Yes. Does it enable the purchasing buyer to make what we consider a strongly educated decision? We believe yes. If they can take those type of decisions up front, we believe we'll be much better off in 2-3 years whenever that platform rolls out into the marketplace. All right. But no matter what we say, we're always going to be still trying to get better because we're learning more each day, each week, each month, as Mindy had said. And with that, we have to continue to adapt our assessment of risk and the impact of value upon our organization in order to stay ahead of the times.
Along with risk. Along with risk, we also talk about whether we should be doing local production, offshore production, nearshore production. How do you balance those things? Because again, you're adding cost, and does this make sense? How do you balance something like that? Why don't you keep going, Greg, and then we'll work our way backwards.
Balance is what I would call the perfect answer to that. All right, because with balance, you've got two sides. One side is kind of the cost. The other side is the risk or performance level that could be impacted. In our particular case, we have manufacturing sites around the globe that are producing what we call platform products. So I could be producing the same Massey Ferguson tractor in China, in Europe, in South America, and in North America. Within that, we want to have a balance of supply, meaning not a single source that could fall into risk, whatever that might be, and also the ability to leverage value. So if exchange rates work in our favor, if the industrial capacity throughout, truck and auto and all that put stress onto our supplier, we want to have options, right? Because options buy you time and enable you to take a decision based on what you want to do, not necessarily the only thing you can do, right? So we don't believe that we will significantly change our sourcing strategy in terms of geography going forward. What we may do and will continue to do is adjust the splits, what percentage we buy from which supplier and which location. And that may be very dynamic. I may change the split from a supplier in China to a production site in Brazil, but maybe I don't change it in North America for whatever particular reason.
Shekhar, you've got a smaller footprint. You're essentially in the United States, Japan, and China, right? So when you think about near sourcing, offshore sourcing, and local sourcing, are you thinking differently now after, say, the pandemic than you were before?
Yes. So thinking about Greg's platform view, for us, it's a little bit different. We are single factory based for global distribution. That's our footprint. So when we think about situations like this and how might we think about the future, we think about it's a great thing when you're designing a product. If you can go across platforms, then you drive commonality, you drive options. But at the same time, situations like this, you just really want to think hard. Is commonality into a single source the best use of your time, or do you start expanding and thinking about creating enough of differences that you can create multi-sources or dual sources, or however the situation may warrant? So as we think about our vehicles of how might we think about the situation going forward, our path is definitely going to be weighted towards making sure that there's an escape route open in case of similar situations that happen anywhere in the world. There's definitely an elevated level of risk management that's going to go into future sourcing decisions.
Bindia, any comments?
Yeah, actually, we have a really strong perspective on this, which is, if you look at the continuum of risk mitigation approaches, the cost and the trade-offs therein, obviously, nearshoring is the most expensive thing you can do to your supply chain. It takes billions of dollars to set up another factory, and I see Greg vehemently agreeing with me. So the reality there is, if you talk about doing a new factory, it can't just be for risk mitigation. That's first of all, right? You have to really optimize the supply chain based on other considerations besides risk, because the reality is that the US or any other country isn't really risk-free. Because ResLink is the purveyor of disruptions worldwide, we know that 25% of all the notifications we send out in a given year are across the US, disruptions that happen in the US. So it's not that the US is risk-free or Europe is risk-free, no country and no region is risk-free. So nearshoring is the most expensive approach. Inventory is the second most expensive. It can be hundreds of millions in additional costs to do inventory. When it comes to second sourcing, it is millions of dollars to tens of millions to have second sources for everything. So when you look at the continuum, setting up new factories nearshore, most expensive, inventory, second most expensive, second sourcing, third most expensive, having visibility and a robust resiliency program, the set based on data and visibility is the least expensive option. Now, having said all of that, I will say that it's super important. We went too far down the cost and inventory reduction route. We do see that there's some correction that we will see. It isn't possible in all sectors, obviously, because, in the life science industry, for instance, where a lot of our customers are, or in high tech, there's tremendous technology, IP, there's complexity. A life science factory has to go through regulatory approvals, which can take 2 to 3 years. And so it's just not that easy. Some industries like apparel and things, it's easier to switch. So we may see some activity there. But for a lot of the more complex industries, we might see a little more of what I think Greg was talking about, which is figuring out and having a playbook for what an alternate site looks like, what capabilities there are, how long would it take to start operating from there, maybe do some pre-qualification work for an alternate, but only trigger it in the event something is needed.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about some of the issues surrounding resilient supply chains. So how do our listeners get there? What's the first thing they should do? Who'd like to start on this? Greg, go ahead. You're smiling.
I think the first thing they want to do is define that they want to do it, right? And not enter into it and with one foot and the other still a little bit hesitant. And yeah, you're shaking your head. You've been through that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And some of that is part of your strategy. What is it that supply chain supports as part of your corporate strategy? And then what is the cost of failure? What are the tools that we can utilize to ensure that we can provide a level of supply, service, whatever it may be? And, what is the insurance policy? And, if you have what we call active risk management program, you're going to find things. You're going to solve everything? No. But you're going to definitely find things out sooner, be able to take advantage of the time that you may hopefully have. And secondly, you're going to basically be able to be proactively looking for some of those things, right? As Bindia had mentioned earlier, the social media has all kinds of data that we didn't have 10 years ago. If you've got people that are surrounding a work site in Germany, well, maybe there's a strike that's going to go on. When do you find out about it? Usually 2 days after your product can ship on time. It's a little bit late. So my answer to that would be understand how supply chain supports your corporate strategy. And then risk management should be one of the tools that we utilize to help enable and sustain that service level.
Okay, how about you, Bindia? What would you suggest first thing?
Yeah, so the way I would suggest is set up. Risk management doesn't have to start big. It's a commitment that you make. And as Greg said, start small and create a process. It doesn't have to be across the 20,000 suppliers in your direct supply chain. Prioritize it down to your top 5 products by revenue and go map those products, because as Shekhar mentioned, there's often a lot of commonality. So by mapping all your single source suppliers across your top 5 revenue products, you're going to get a lot of visibility across other platforms anyway. It's a great, very simple way to get started monitoring your supply chain, getting some mapping going. What it does is very important. It creates muscle memory, right, in your organization. Now, with this little program you have established, you've created a place where people know where you're going to be notified about events and where to go in case there's something happens. And that gets triggered. So just like, I'll give you a good analogy and then end is, you know, when a ambulance pulls up in front of an emergency ward, whether it's one ambulance or 25, the nurses don't go into a panic. They follow a set process because there's muscle memory. They know what to do, where to go, what data to get from where, what supplies to get. They know. The reason they know is they do this every single day. And in a given year, there are literally 600 events that happen. There are 2 to 3 every day that happen that have some impact to the supply chain that you need to pick up the phone and just make sure with the supplier everything's okay. So this small stuff builds up to a capability that really can support the black swan of black swan events, which is really what we lived through the last 3 months.
Okay, excellent. Shekhar? Oh, Bindi, I got to ask you one follow-up question. Is this something a small company can do also?
Yeah, in fact, our smallest customer is a $5 million revenue company, and they do a very simple monitoring capability, and it's wonderful because it helps them stay compliant on their automotive, large automotive customers that they do a small portion of business for. So
great. Shekhar, how about you? What's the one thing what was, you know, or even better, what was the first thing you did?
Yeah, so once I said, I think it's about making sure your data set is right, you have a single source of truth for all the information. Next, looking at your inventory levels, understanding the stuff, what's in the pipeline coming towards you. Once you assess that, then you can very quickly say what actions you need to take. So dovetailing that back into the comments from Greg and Bindi, thinking about what do you do in situations like this? We had a supplier risk assessment management process that we were following on our key suppliers. What this has accelerated is deploying that across the entire organization, training everybody to think in the same way, everybody being the frontline nurse, being able to see, respond, and activate your responses to events like these. So that's how we thought about it. That's how we're transitioning into reacting to these situations going forward.
Excellent. Well, I'm afraid we have run out of time. So this concludes our third conversation in ASME Mechanical Engineering series of Rebooting After the Pandemic. First, let me thank our panelists, Greg Turnman, Bindya Vakil, and Shekhar Visvanathan. I know how busy purchasing people are these days, and I appreciate every second you spent with us. I also want to thank our sponsor, Eccentric Mold and Engineering. Also, our next conversation in this series on June 16th will be making robots ubiquitous after COVID-19, moderated by Managing Editor Chitra Sethi, who will be looking at how factories embrace robotics and automation in the time of pandemic. Thank you once again for tuning in, and I hope you'll join us for our next conversation. Thank you.